All right, so some tips on cutting skillfully with a 9-inch grinder blade, and also avoid impaling yourself with a fractured blade. You know, the segments on these diamond teeth can come flying off if you overheat the blade. You can easily get the blade warped in a cut, and then the grinder could bite and send you flying one way or the other, and you could lose control of the grinder. That's how people get seriously injured. These discs can even fly off the mounts, right? This is a flush mount blade here, which looks exactly like this as a newer version. You can get these shipped with the mounts already attached to them. I think that's a pretty good way to go about it. It's really, you're not really paying much more to get it pre-mounted. You're coming with a fresh mount. It's already mounted, which means that they've sent it out with essentially a product guarantee that everything's going to be, you know, not overly tightened, not under tightened. So then you're eliminating your own user error by getting some pre-mounted blades like this. I think you can get these on Amazon for like $70 to $80 USD or Canadian. I'm not exactly sure. I can't remember because the prices are always going up these days. Anyways, so you may have noticed that I'm not cutting with a guard. So some tips on cutting without a, well, there's a few reasons that you wouldn't want to cut with a guard. If the guard comes past your flush mount, then it totally nullifies the purpose of having a flush mount. The purpose of having a flush mount blade is so that you can cut continuously through on the same plane on a surface, and then you just cut the stone away from where you've cut into, and then you can keep grind. Essentially, you can grind with it, right? You can grind with it and you can cut with it. And so if you could do both at the same time, it allows you to cut a smooth continuous plane, right? Whereas with something like a quick cut or a standard angle grinder and or blade that you can get from the hardware store, it'll always have a mount that goes on the arbor, a little lock nut, and it always sticks up past the blade. And so because of that, you're locked to a specific cutting depth, and then as long as there's an edge to grab onto that mount, you can't continuously cut anymore, right? So that's the reason why a stonemason that's doing a lot of stone cutting, architectural stone cutting, just surfacing in general, you're going to see we use a lot of flush mount blades. You can't get these from like Home Hardware or Home Depot, Rona. Like you got to order them, right? Usually they're from across seas or from China. So do some shopping there. If you want my advice, I would just ask me in the comments and I can maybe hook you up with some links. But one thing to note when you're cutting with these is, first of all, this is fresh material. This is the first time I'm cutting this geological specimen per se. And so I have to get a feel for it, right? So you always got to be cautious when you first start cutting. See how you can almost immediately tell how abrasive the stone is. If the blade starts to overheat or if it starts to cut slower, right? You know it's overheating if your blade gets twisted because it'll start to warp, right? Which means it could be very dangerous if you're cutting without that guard. So one of the things is, you may have noticed in this footage that I try to avoid placing my head to look down at my cut line above the blade, right? Because if the blade breaks when I'm looking at it, the pieces are going to come flying into my face, right? Especially if you absolutely critical you wear safety glasses. I don't care how safe you think you are, you never look at a spinning blade without safety glasses. And ideally you don't look at a spinning blade, period, right? Maybe just to get started, and then quickly move yourself out of the way and make sure your jugular is also out of the way, right? Just get your whole upper body, you know, your lifeline out of the way of the blade, because you never know what can happen, right? I've been very fortunate, nothing's ever happened to me. So this stone specifically is heating up the blade pretty fast. This is a more abrasive limestone than the limestone that I'm already using on the same project, which looks almost identical, but they are a different geological makeup. And there's a lot of differences in what you can do with the product based on the geology of the stone. It doesn't come from the exact same quarry as the other stone, even though they're both a metamorphic hard limestone, Dolomitic in nature. You know, one could be more abrasive than the other. One could have different bedding planes, and so they tend to act differently with your cutting material, whether it's chisels or diamond blades. So I get a feel for it first, and then you make sure you're comfortable as you're cutting through that kerf. Like I said, if it starts to slow down, stop, let the blade breathe, or swap it out for another blade. I've got 3 blades that I can swap between, or I just take it easy, right? Another thing is too, I rock back and forth. I try to not just dive to a straight depth in one spot. The reason for that is because if you're cutting a continuous line that's quite long, you generally want to make sure that your stability, right, your actual skill in handling the blade, you want to make sure that you're stable and holding that blade at the exact same angle all the time as you're cutting through. So a lot of that comes down to developing your strength and your balance in your forearms, but also your hips, your knees, your posture, right? You want to make sure that you're almost like you're ready to jump out of the way, but also that in a way that you're stabilized, right? So you have your feet spread apart enough where you can rock your body without adjusting your feet, because anytime you need to pick up your feet and move while you're cutting, you're most likely going to shift your arms, your hands, even a little bit, and that can result in an immediate twist of the blade, and that thing can just go rip right out. And if that happens, not only will your blade potentially be ruined, right? You'll have to replace it. It'll always have a wobble, which means you're never going to cut nicely. You can get seriously injured, right? All right, one important thing I almost forgot to mention. How does the blade spin? Because this is actually very important as well, because that's going to tell you the direction in which you should start cutting from front to back, what's front, what's back. If the blade does bite or gets away from you, which way is it going to go? Knowing all this is also going to keep you safe and keep you cutting more accurately. So right, these grinders are typically, you can adjust this whole handle set here just by clipping that in and rotating this. So depending whether you're left-handed or right-handed, you might have your own preference. Personally, I have the trigger face the open end of this trigger handle. I don't know if you can see that, facing towards the blade, and that means that the blade is always cutting clockwise for me. Likewise, this grip can come off and you can put it on the top here if you're doing like grinding work. I never use that. Or the other way, right? Sometimes you're in an awkward position up against a wall, depending if it's your left or your right side, and you need the blade to be on one side or the other, which means that you're going to have to adapt cutting in those different ways, and that is another skill set to cutting that is quite particular, because usually people are just better on one side rather than the other. It's kind of like being left-handed or right-handed. Unless you're perfectly ambidextrous, you could struggle cutting the other direction, right? So typically I'm cutting clockwise like this, right? So the dust is always spinning, the dust is always coming at me, right? Which means that it can sometimes block my vision a little bit. So that's the one downside to cutting like that. The upside is if it gets away from me, the blade is always gonna go forward, right, as opposed to coming back at me. So if I cut the other way like this, right, now the blade can come at me, which can be dangerous, right? So I got to watch out for that. But the dust is going to go away. It's going to spin out from this underside, which means that you can direct it. You can direct the dust at a fan or a dust extraction like a Levco hose, right? So that if you want to be less dusty, get good at cutting this way. If you want to have less blades potentially flying at you, cut the other way. But really, it's just a matter of comfort, what feels better for you, because that's also going to determine what end of a cut you will likely start at. So for me, I can start at the back and I can cut towards me, right? But if I go the other way, it has a greater chance of spinning off, right? So if I start at this end, it has nothing to spin off into, right? Whereas if I'm cutting the other way, I would typically start at the opposite end, right? So if you do have to make an adjustment like that, where you're switching sides, you got to be aware that you have to cut in the reverse order that you're typically cutting in, right? But you still stick with the same techniques with your position, making sure that you're stable and everything like that. And then it's just a matter of practice makes perfect. So yeah, those are my tips for cutting with a 9-inch. If there's anything else I could think of, I'll add it in a future video. make sure to subscribe to the channel. This long format style of video, I'm going to keep doing it for now, and hopefully I can continue doing that. I know the shorts seem to be doing better, but this is all kind of a test for me right now. I'm uploading every day, long format, short format, so make sure to subscribe, hit the notification buttons, and if you're enjoying the content, leave a comment. I mean,